The beginning of abstract expressionism and the new American sculpture was around the 1940s, when America was still involved with World War II and still recovering from the Great Depression. Many Americans didn't feel safe or secure, and they were filled with skepticism. They had trouble picturing a safe and peaceful future. Therefore, many artists didn't want to create old forms of expression. This led artists in a broader direction of intellectual thought, such as existentialism, the belief that philosophical thinking begins with the human, not merely the thinking subject, but the acting, feeling, living human individual. The horrors brought on by the Nazis under Hitler's rule were so atrocious that artists struggled to find meaning in their works. They felt like just as life would never be the same, so too will art never be the same. In this respect, it was inevitable that drastic and radical changes were going to happen with art. Many European art institutions, such as schools and museums, were crippled due to the war, and many European art dealers and collectors had been killed and their collections stolen by the Nazis. It was during this time that New York City became the new cultural art center of the world. New York had become a refuge for many European artists such as Duchamp, Mondrian, André Masson, and Hans Hofmann. New York was also the gathering place for progressive American artists. Piet Mondrian moved to America just before the start of World War II in 1938, where he spent the last 4 years of his life. Mondrian loved the energy of New York with all the dance halls and jazz bands, and he was inspired to translate these rhythms in his paintings. This piece by Mondrian is called Broadway Boogie Woogie. In this painting, we can see, if not just from the title, that Mondrian no longer had the deep spiritual meanings in his work. Here, Mondrian reverses his method. Instead, his black grids are now filled with different colors set against an off-white ground. He developed a method where he could easily shift the colors around until he found the desired arrangement. Mondrian became a legend in the United States who inspired many American artists. Even the abstract expressionists, whose works were quite the opposite, respected and admired the paintings created by Mondrian. Now, some of the artists who escaped to America and moved to New York were the Surrealists, such as Mata, Masson, and Moreau, who introduced these new artists to organic, abstract, automatist surrealism, and also introduced the idea of psychic automatism. These new artists didn't share the same passions of wanting to tap into their subconscious like the Surrealists, but what they did take from these interactions were directions on how to explore new forms of expression. For this reason, it was the Surrealists that exerted the strongest influence on the abstract expressionists. As you will see, American expressionist art is very diverse, although there were two main general directions taken. One was referred to as the gestural painters, who focused on a spontaneous and unique expression of the artist, often referred to as the artist's hand. Some of these major artists were Franz Kline, Jackson Pollock, and William de Kooning. The other direction taken consisted of the color field painters, who were concerned with creating abstractions using large unified colors or colored shaped areas. These major artists were Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, and Adolf Gottlieb, and Still. Harold Rosenberg was an art critic who in 1952 first used the phrase action painting. Rosenberg referred to this process as a spontaneous gesture placed on the canvas. He stated that artists were now putting physical acts on the canvas, and they were no longer reproducing images on the canvas. Therefore, according to Rosenberg, what was now going on the canvas was not a picture, but an event. Despite this description, there was still some thought as to what went on the canvas. There was a fine line between spontaneity and forethought. This painting is by Hans Hofmann titled Spring. Here we see a product of Hans Hofmann's experiments with automatic painting as a way to invoke new forms. This painting precedes Pollock's drip paintings. Hofmann was one of the major art educators and theoreticians in the U.S. who influenced artists such as Lee Krasner and critics such as Clement Greenberg, who became one of the premier art critics of this time. Greenberg had very opinionated viewpoints on what modernist painting was and should be. According to Greenberg, modernist painting is defined by its emphasis on flatness. This image is by Arshile Gorky, and it's titled The Liver is the Coxcomb from 1944. This is a large painting over 6 by 8 feet. Here we see recognizable imagery such as claws and feathers, along with more overtly sexual references. This is an erotically charged painting which resembles an abstracted wild landscape. If you look closely, you can see the influences of Kandinsky and Moreau through the colors and biomorphic imagery. William de Kooning was one of the first major art expressionists. He was originally from the Netherlands and had intense training in art at the Rotterdam Academy before arriving at the United States. He was one to engage in art discussions, and he inspired many of the young experimental painters of the 1940s. This painting here is titled Woman One. Part of what makes de Kooning unique is his ability to shift between pure abstraction and representational imagery. He also claimed that he had a natural desire to explore the, and I quote, eternal feminine. He continued to make these kinds of figures into the 1970s. De Kooning is quoted as saying, even abstract shapes must have likeness. This painting is over 6 feet high and about 4 feet wide, so when this is seen hanging on a wall, it carries a dynamic presence, and therefore the scale of the work is a major factor when appreciating abstract expressionism. The slashing strokes of de Kooning's painting of woman equate intense aesthetic scrutiny with violence. We can see the quick, harsh, messy strokes that appear to be quite vicious. Here we have the ordinary figure of a seated woman amidst the shocking brushstrokes that create an intense tension in this painting, and in many of his other paintings of women. During an exhibit of his paintings of women in 1953, he was quoted as saying that his work was wrapped in a melodrama of vulgarity. De Kooning saw humor in his work. Unfortunately, the critics at the time did not see humor. Instead, they saw a more negative view on women. De Kooning was like the Surrealists in the respect that they both saw a relationship between the comic, the desired, and the terrifying, which they projected onto the female body. De Kooning also compared these paintings as being the result of his own feminine side, meaning the female within himself. De Kooning referred to Jackson Pollock's strip paintings as breaking the ice. There's a good movie about Jackson Pollock, starring Ed Harris, that came out a few years ago. It shows the interactions in the New York art scene with Peggy Guggenheim, de Kooning, art critic Greenberg, and his relationship with Lee Krasner. It also shows how his style matured and his bouts with alcoholism that led to his untimely death from a car accident. This painting by Pollock is titled Guardians of the Secret. This precedes his major drip paintings and has implied figures and representations of strange creatures and animals. This energy-filled canvas has figures standing at both left and right ends of the painting. And there's a white area right here, and it's either a table, altar, or funeral bier, meaning funeral stand. We see a watchdog laying on the bottom, and the watchdog's right here. If you look, you could see his little paw, and then his ears and eye and nose. So here's his head, and his body goes back. So we see this dog along with other creatures with self-described markings that resemble an ancient language floating around the scene. Pollock had an interest in Navajo sand paintings and ancient cultures. He also subscribed to Carl Jung's theories about the collective unconscious. This is one of Pollock's most famous paintings, titled No. 1A, 1948. There's a term called all-over painting, where the entire surface is covered or treated in a uniform manner. You may often hear this term when reading or talking about artists like Jackson Pollock or the color field painters. Here, the all-over painting is in the form of drips and splatters. What separates Pollock's work from Hans Hofmann's early drip-like painting called Spring is that Hofmann's painting was small and intimate. Pollock transcends his work into a more complex and larger, almost monumental scale. This piece is over 5 by 8 feet. Pollock creates layer over layer over layer of these lines and drips of oil and enamel paint. Some of his paintings you may see handprints, footprints, shoe prints, or even a cigarette butt that has fallen and stuck to the canvas. While it appears to be a black and white painting, there are other colors embedded in the canvas. We can see smudges of magenta or reddish pink color in our lower left corner, and that's right down here. All right, but you can also see it scattered throughout the canvas also. Let me just get rid of that mark. Now the paint goes right across and off the canvas, giving the feeling that the painting expands beyond its own space. Pollock would often lay these canvases on the floor, where he would then drip the paint on with a brush, or even let the paint drip or pour right out of the can as it flew across the canvas. This process can be referred to as action painting. The term action painting refers to art that privileges or honors not only the final work, but also the process. Despite the fact that his work looks completely random, it is quite the opposite. Pollock thought very carefully about his compositions, and even though there is an element of chance through his spontaneity, it is important to know that there was also an organized thought process that went into his work. This painting is, of course, not abstract expressionism. Now, even though abstract expressionism was forming and starting to take precedence in New York and abroad, the American realist tradition was still thriving. Andrew Wyeth was one of the most famous American painters of the day, and this painting, called Christina's World, shows one of Wyeth's neighbors from Cushing, Maine, which was a place where he would spend his summers. Due to a polio infection in her younger years, Christina Olson could not walk and was often seen crawling on the family farm across the fields. We can see the distance between her and the farmhouse and the exhausting effort it must have been on her fragile body to finish her journey home. Now, if you remember, we looked at Edward Hopper and discussed how alienation was common in his works. So too was alienation common in many of Andrew Wyeth's works. In fact, this theme was common with many representational artists following World War II. Pollock's No. 1A 1948 painting and Andrew Wyeth's painting titled Christina's World were both purchased by the Museum of Modern Art in the same year of 1950. Now we're going to jump back to abstract expressionism with this Lee Krasner painting from 1949. Lee Krasner was born in Brooklyn and studied in New York art schools. She was a student of Hans Hofmann, who taught her about Cubism. Her early work was Cubist abstractions, inspired by Mondrian and Cubism. Lee Krasner met Jackson Pollock while they were both exhibiting in a show for young artists. In 1942, the two shared a studio, and 3 years later they married and moved to Long Island. Krasner's work moved from abstract cubism towards more spontaneous gestures that filled the canvas. However, unlike Pollock's drip paintings, Krasner has more structure. If we look at the painting, we see forms that are vertically organized in almost readable fashion, as if we, the viewer, are meant to read the cryptic or ancient language. There is no language or message to read. However, the markings and their arrangements maintain a mystery which creates a prolonged engagement with the viewer. The colors and lines create a rhythm where the forms give the impression of wanting to move around the canvas. This next piece by Lee Krasner, called Milkweed, shows her interest in collages. This is oil, paper, and canvas on canvas. Here we see cutouts that are sharp. These cutouts overlap each other that are individually reminiscent of her early drawings. For her collages, she used the scraps from both her and Pollock's canvases. The fusion of both her and Pollock's materials is a metaphor for individual artists to suppress their personalities and objectives in order to enter fully into a collaborative of artistic partnership. Krasner has her own artistic vision separate from Pollock's. She proved that abstract expressionism was not just a masculine movement, which was extremely difficult to do post-World War II anxieties and national and international uneasiness. Like Mondrian, Franz Kline was interested in the aspects and rhythms of contemporary America. Kline studied the art from Rembrandt to Goya and attended art academies in Boston and London. His early works are more traditional paintings of urban scenes and figures that had characteristics of social realism. He often started out doing small black and white sketches. Many of these sketches would be fragments to larger images. In 1949, Kline started looking at these small fragmented black and white sketches through a projector and realized that creating on a large scale, these paintings would be powerful. This new vocabulary he created for his expressive abstracts did, however, take some time to develop. This piece here is titled Nijinsky. It is an enamel on canvas from 1950. Unlike fellow artists such as Pollock and de Kooning, Kline worked out his compositions in advance using preliminary sketches. This is viewed as a meditative figurative piece of the Russian dancer as Petrushka in Stravinsky's ballet. Kline's works were carefully thought out and planned, but he did embrace gestural freedom and understood the value of immediate mark-making, which provided movement that liberated the composition from being too tight. Hans Hofmann originally stated, and it was further shown in both Krasner's and Kline's works, that abstract expressionism was not just a form of automatism, but many of the works were again carefully thought out and planned. Mark Tobey was an artist working on the West Coast out in Seattle, quite a long way from New York. Tobey was very religious and part of the Baha'i faith, and he is quoted as saying that his belief stresses the unity of the world and the oneness of mankind. He studied Chinese brush painting and went to Japan and China and studied Zen Buddhism. Tobey incorporated his learned calligraphy into his abstractions. He used line to communicate in his works expressive content. This painting here is titled Universal Field from 1949. The calligraphy marks in this painting are referred to as white writing. Here, on a shallow space, we see markings in most white, but also some black, fly across a canvas with speed and energy. Philip Gaston was friends with Jackson Pollock and followed him to New York in 1936. He later taught painting at Iowa City and St. Louis. Then in the 1940s, Gaston began painting loose geometric abstractions. In the 1950s, Gaston produced paintings like this one titled Zone. Here we see an impasto technique, which basically means heavily applied paint. The earth tones and muted reds and pinks give a suggestion of lyrical landscapes. But this was not his intention. He was more interested in the process of creating than its outcome. During the 1960s, Gaston enjoyed success by having a major retrospective of his work at the Guggenheim and at New York's Jewish Museum. Gaston began to feel that abstraction was limited in terms of representing the full human experience. He eventually returned to figuration because he wanted to tell stories. Here we have a painting of Harold Rosenberg, number 3, by Elaine de Kooning. Elaine de Kooning married William de Kooning in 1943. Elaine was a writer on contemporary art for Art News magazine. She made several male portraits. In this painting, we see extremely expressive brushstrokes and a line work that helped to define the art critic Harold Rosenberg. We see Rosenberg seated in a relaxed position in an armchair, and the warm red rug at his feet and again leading to the door in the upper right corner of the canvas. This tension of the relaxed figure within all the energized brushstrokes of color adds interest to the painting. Now we're going to talk about color field painting. Basically, color field artists painted large fields of flat, solid colors that they separated across or stained into the canvas. This type of painting creates areas of unbroken surface and a flat picture plane. In color field painting, color is free from any objective context and thus becomes its own subject. Some of the main field color painters were Mark Rothko, Adolf Gottlieb, and Barnett Newman. These three artists stressed that their abstractions contained meaningful content. They believed that through their simple expressions, they could communicate complex thoughts and bring out deep emotional responses in the viewers. They felt that large shapes and flat planes would destroy illusion and reveal truth. This painting, referred to as Rothko number 5068.49, is by Mark Rothko. Starting around the 1940s, after he studied art at the Students' Art League in New York, Rothko became interested in the readings of Jung and Nietzsche. Rothko viewed ancient myths as a foundation of eternal symbols. In the article that Rothko, Gottlieb, and Newman wrote for the New York Times, they declared their, and I quote, spiritual kinship with primitive archaic art. Rothko floated shapes around the canvas that had undefined soft edges. He later, like we see here, simplified his shapes. These floating rectangles are created using many thin washes of oil paint that develop into luminous, sensuous colors. Rothko created works in this manner for over 20 years. Rothko's paintings were designed without any one focal point. Rothko wanted the viewer to be immersed and absorbed into his paintings. Rothko began to work on a larger scale using darker and deeper colors. This image here shows Mark Rothko's last series of work that consisted of 14 large panels that filled the walls in a Rothko chapel in Houston, Texas. It was created in 1965 to 1966, but didn't open till 1971. The large panels are painted in layers of deep blacks and red browns. The positioning of the panels were meant to harmonize and be consistent with the octagonal building and its changing light. This room represents a fusion between architecture and paintings like that of the religious murals of the 17th century Baroque. Although Rothko doesn't have any representational imagery, instead, his paintings are designed to give the viewer a transcending experience that is more emotional and meditative. In the 1920s, Barnett Newman attended the Art Students League in New York. It wasn't until the 1940s that his career started to develop. However, he did not receive the immediate attention like other artists such as Pollock, Rothko, and de Kooning. This painting by Newman, titled Genesis, the Break, is representative of his early interest in botany, which is a study of plants, and ornithology, the study of birds. Here we see his exploration on the theme of birth and creation through primordial forms taking shape. The circle represents a seed. It has been said that this painting is about the separation of heaven and earth. This next image by Newman, called 1-Mint-1 from 1948, was his breakthrough painting where he developed his basic formula of a unified color field interrupted by a vertical line. Newman referred to these vertical lines as zips. Newman saw these zips that ran through the length of his canvas almost as tears that open the picture plane. These paintings don't have the atmospheric effects as Rothko paintings, but Newman creates incredible beauty in his work by the way he brushes on subtle variations of tone and color. This next painting by Clyfford Still is referred to as number 2. Still refused to give titles to his works because he didn't want any association to any specific subject. This large painting was over 7 by 5 feet, depicts crusty areas of color that seem to be floating throughout the canvas. Still is quoted as saying that his work is about man's struggle and fusion with nature. Adolf Gottlieb was an artist who also studied at the Art Students League in New York. Gottlieb's mentors were John Sloan and Robert Henri. He became friends with Mark Rothko, Milton Avery, and Barnett Newman, all of whom had some sort of influence towards his later works. In this painting, titled Orb from the Burst series, we see a blue pulsating orb above a rough black floating mass. Gottlieb's Burst series represented a cosmic landscape. His imagery for this series usually consisted of a circular element that may suggest a burning sun above an exploding element. The two pieces of imagery are meant to contrast each other. This series combines aspects of color field painting and gestural painting. Overall, this series represents dualities such as the creation of civilization and its destruction, possibly related to memories of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, by America in 1945. Robert Motherwell was for the most part a self-taught artist, although he was well educated. He studied literature, art history, and philosophy at Stanford, Columbia, and Harvard. He took an interest in surrealism, mainly automatism, and became acquainted with surrealist artists Max Ernst, Tanguy, Mason, and Mata. Robert Motherwell edited an influential book called The Dada Painters and Poets in 1951. This painting that we are looking at is titled Pancho Villa, Dead and Alive. It is a collage of gouache and oil with cut and pasted paper on cardboard. While traveling in Mexico, Motherwell became fascinated by a photograph of Pancho Villa, who was one of the most prominent Mexican revolutionary generals. The photograph showed Villa dead and covered in blood. These stick figures represent Villa, and they relate to a painting from the 1920s by Picasso. The circle or oval shapes that we see here that are connected or held together by vertical architectural elements is something that can be seen in many of Motherwell's future works, like this later painting titled Elegy to the Spanish Republic, number 34. From 1936 to 1939, there was the Spanish Civil War that was fought between the Republicans, who were loyal to the democratically elected Spanish Republic, and the Nationalists, which was a fascist rebel group. Motherwell created over 150 different paintings related to the elegy theme, expressing his reaction to the defeat by fascist forces in 1939. This painting, as with many from the series, were made using primarily black and white, black representing death and white representing life. Here we see simple forms of circular ovals held up by vertical rectangles. Motherwell's paintings continued to increase in size as he progressed with this series. Robert Motherwell said that his forms were emblems of universal tragedy. David Smith was one of the pioneer sculptors of his generation. David Smith's chosen medium was welded steel. Smith liked steel because it had little history to it. It was a relatively new metal that had associations of modern times, representing power, progress, movement, brutality, and suspension. This piece here is called The Letter from 1950. This piece is like a three-dimensional drawing. The title implies that these images or symbols tell a story of some sort, although we don't know what it is. These next pieces by David Smith are again made of steel, stainless steel, and are of his last monumental series called Kubi. Here we see large geometric shapes such as cylinders, squares, and rectangles connected together in interesting arrangements. These pieces are polished and highly reflective. David Smith did not like using assistants to help create his sculptures. Even though these pieces appear to have a machine-like precision, they were almost entirely constructed and finished by Smith alone. Louise Bourgeois was a French-American artist and sculptor. Much of her work deals with themes of betrayal, loneliness, and anxiety. Her work is very dark, disturbing, and at times flat-out scary. She is most well known for her spider structures, which eventually led to her being nicknamed the Spider Woman. Bourgeois' largest spider sculpture, titled Maman, which is French for mother, her Maman was loomed over numerous locations around the world, standing at over 30 feet high and 33 feet wide. Her large spiders have sacks underneath the bodies that carry 26 marbles, and that would be right down here. This one is located in London. The original sculpture was dated from 1999, but this one is from 2007. And the reason why we're discussing this contemporary piece of sculpture is because this idea or theme had begun for Bourgeois in 1947 through several small ink and charcoal drawings, which is roughly the time period we're talking about now. This is a much less disturbing earlier piece by Louise Bourgeois. She started as a painter and engraver who was strongly influenced by Surrealism. Bourgeois in the late 1940s turned to carved wooden sculpture. This piece here is titled Quarantania 1. Quarantania refers to the Mount of Temptation, which is said to be the hill in the Judean desert where Jesus was tempted by the devil. These vertical forms she referred to as personages. These personages are each gifted with individual personalities and are best experienced as a group. It is said that they represent friends and family that she had left behind when she left Paris for America. It is also said that they represent her family at this time, with she and her husband and 3 small boys. These 5 elements are very important to her. These personages, as with all of Louise Bourgeois' work, have strong psychic associations connected to her own life story. Joseph Cornell is also inspired by Surrealism. This piece here is titled Medici Slot Machine from 1942. It is considered a construction piece. Cornell liked to make assemblages in window box formations with a glass front. In the box he would arrange his objects. Cornell had broad interests ranging from French 19th century literature to poetry to natural sciences and astronomy. He often found objects and other materials for his pieces in penny arcades and souvenir shops. Joseph Cornell lived a life of solitude and rarely talked about his work. In this piece we can see reproductions of a Renaissance portrait, some images taken from early cinema, and symbols that relate to both past and present. There is a romantic quality about this piece. Cornell liked to create intimate and magical worlds inside these boxes. The images he placed in his boxes are arranged in a loose, geometric format. His works create a safe feeling of nostalgia. He would often distress his objects and boxes to give them more of an antique appearance. Although he was influenced by Surrealism, Cornell did not want to be classified as being a Surrealist. Cornell had no interest in the dream world or the unconscious. Cornell instead wanted to focus on healthier possibilities. Some have described his boxes as having therapeutic potential. This piece by Louise Nevelson is titled Dawn's Wedding Chapel 1. Nevelson, like Cornell, worked in assemblage, although her work is very different. Nevelson studied dance, voice, and art in New York. While in Europe, she studied painting with Hans Hofmann, along with taking some small roles in movies. Nevelson was an eccentric woman who liked to dress and act in a flamboyant manner. As we see here, Nevelson used found objects. This piece was part of a larger installation for the Museum of Modern Art in 1959. This is a freestanding piece. The shallow boxes contain small wooden objects that are whitewashed, and even though these objects are found and can be seen as junk, having them painted white gives them a quality of decayed elegance. We're going to look at two photographers now. This is a photograph by Minor White titled Sun and Rock Devil Slide from 1947. White's Sun and Rock Devil Slide demonstrates the capacity of straight photography to yield abstract form. This photograph is similar to the stylistic developments found in many abstract expressionism's gestural paintings. White was a teacher and was the founder and editor of Aperture magazine, which enabled him to influence many future generations of photographers. This last photographer is Aaron Siskind. Siskind was also interested in finding the abstract in art through his photography. This piece is titled Chicago from 1949. Here we see a flat form against a textured surface. He often would discover his imagery in old weathered advertising signs, graffiti, old walls, and peeling posters. Siskind liked to find expressive qualities in two-dimensional design. If you look, you can see the influences of William de Kooning and Franz Kline.